Hey everyone. So I just got done watching probably my favorite anime of 2021, or at least in my top three, and that's Odd Taxi. And if you're here for my review of Odd Taxi, this goes without saying, there are spoilers ahead. So if you haven't seen the show or if you haven't finished it yet, I'd suggest you go finish it first and then come back and see my review. Okay, but with that warning out of the way, let's talk about the story of Odd Taxi. So Odd Taxi follows Odokawa, who is a taxi driver, and the story is centered around the disappearance of a teenage girl. And it's pretty much Odokawa's interactions with his passengers and with the people around him and how they're all related or somehow connected to the disappearance of this missing girl. Now, Odokawa himself is kind of an interesting character because he is a little sheltered, what you would describe as socially awkward person, very uncomfortable talking to people of the opposite sex, has very few friends. He does have some close friends, but not very many. Doesn't really like to socialize, doesn't really talk a lot to the passengers that get in his taxi. He's kind of a person who just keeps to himself. And there's definitely a lot of reason why that is, but you learn about that as you get towards the end of the show. So what I want to do first is I want to talk about the ending of the show. I've kind of given you a brief overview of what the show's about, but if you're here watching this, it's because you've already seen the show, right? So let's get into the end, what the end means, what happened with the disappearing girl, what is it about Odokawa that makes him just a little bit off. Let's talk about that first, and then I want to call out some things that I found really, really interesting in the show, and we'll go from there. So first, let's talk about the ending. Okay, so at the end of the show, there's a lot of things that are revealed, but I really want to focus on the biggest ones. And so there's three major reveals that I think you learn at the end of the show. Okay, so let's start with the very first one, and that is that all the animals that you see on the show, all the characters, they're not actually animals. They're actually humans. Now, unless you're a much better detective or a better watcher than I am, I was mind blown. I did not see that coming at all. I suspected it a little bit towards really the last episode or two, but nowhere in the first 10 or 11 episodes of the season did I suspect that they weren't actually animals, that they were actually humans, and Odokawa actually just sees them. He perceives them as animals. We learn in the show that Odokawa suffers from something called visual agnosia. And we learn about that from the gorilla Dr. Gariki reading through his journals, and he starts trying to piece things together, and he talks to a former doctor that had treated Odokawa when he was younger, that Odokawa had a pretty traumatic experience and he had an accident when he was little, right? And so this accident impacted his brain, and as a result, he sees people, he perceives them as animals. Now, why is that? Well, as you're watching the final episode, you learn that Odokawa was actually a human child, but he was abused. He was verbally, emotionally, and maybe to some regard, like physically abused by his parents, and not just his parents, but by students in his class, and by his teachers, he even mentions. So any interaction that he's had with any humans has been a negative interaction. And the only positive interactions in his life are the interactions that he has with animals. You read about it in his journal that he loves animals. He loves spending time at the zoo. He often compares himself to animals. Actually, in one scene, he says that he feels like he's a walrus because a walrus is fat just like him. And while Odokawa can't really look at people in the eyes, right? He's had such a bad interaction with human beings, he can't stand to face them eye to eye. He's able to look at animals happily, or he welcomes it, right? And that's why when he suffers that accident and he has that visual agnosia, he pictures everyone as animals, and he doesn't know any different. He doesn't have a memory, a recollection that he once was a human. He kind of just wakes up and he sees everyone as animals and doesn't really, I guess, bother to remember the difference that they're not, that they were actually humans. He's able to interact with them because he doesn't have to see them as human beings anymore. He doesn't have to be afraid anymore. He sees them as the animals that he has come to love, and so he's able to have conversations with them. I thought that was a really cool twist, that if you didn't catch on to it early, then you were in for a really big surprise when you find out that everyone that you've been seeing, right, the gorilla, alligator, the alpaca, the monkey, the Damon brothers who are meerkats, everyone really is just a human but seen through Otokawa's eyes, they're all animals. Okay, so the second thing that I picked up from the ending of the show is who the missing girl actually was. So the missing character was actually Yuki Mitsuya, who was one of the singers or the founding band members of Mystery Kiss. She was one of the original 3, and only a few people had actually seen her perform with the group Mystery Kiss before they made their big debut. Not only was she a Mystery Kiss member, but you also find out that her father was a significant figure in the comedy scene, not just the comedy scene, but just a significant person in their world. Her father is named Donraku Shofute. Oftentimes you hear him in the show called Don Chan, and you find out that he is a famous commentator, he's a famous storyteller, someone active in the social media community, and part of the reason why they wanted to keep her disappearance a secret, or why he called off the missing persons report, is because he does have some connections to essentially the mafia, the Yakuza. He's connected to Kuroda, who you see in the show often portrayed as the elephant that's, 24 hours in the sauna. And so she wasn't just some actress or singer trying to make it big in Mystery Kiss. She was actually the daughter of a very famous person with connections to some gang affiliations. And the last big reveal that you learn in the final episode is who the actual killer was. You find out that the person responsible for Yuki Mitsuya's disappearance is Sakura Wadagaki. So she was someone who auditioned to be a part of the band, but ended up coming up in 4th place, so she didn't quite get a spot in the band. But you find out that she has this ambition to make it in the world no matter what. And when I say no matter what, I mean no matter what, because she goes as far as to take out Yuki Mitsuya. Right, so she murders her, essentially takes her spot in the band Mystery Kiss, and you see towards in that final episode that her career is actually starting to take off. Mystery Kiss starts to go down, but Sakura's career starts to go up. And at the very end of the episode, you hear her on the phone and she's saying that she still needs to tighten up some loose ends that really tie her back as the murderer. And that loose end is the taxi driver who had seen both of the girls get into his taxi. Right, so both Sakura and both Yuki got into his taxi. He has them on the dash cam. And so she goes out looking for the taxi driver. And at the very last scene, she gets into Otokawa's taxi. But because of Otokawa's visual agnosia, he doesn't recognize her when she gets in the back of his taxi this time. And all he says is, "Where to?" You see her with kind of a smiling grin because she's there essentially to kill our boy Otokawa and tighten up that loose end that she left. So that was the ending. I loved it. I thought it was a really, really cool twist on a funny, kind of comedic murder mystery story. But let's talk about some things about the show that I found really interesting, or some connections that I made as I was watching the show, and maybe you made the same ones. All right, so the first really interesting thing that I wanted to call out was the backstory of Tanaka, because they had one episode that was entirely dedicated to him. And at first I really wasn't sure why that episode was in there, but halfway through that episode I realized this was a really cool character development. Even if he wasn't a main character, kind of just a side story, I thought the themes that they brought into his character and into his episode were amazing. I saw a lot of similarities in Tanaka and my own personal life, and maybe you can relate as well, where sometimes you see all of these coincidences happening around your life and it makes you wonder, is this really just chance? Is this really just coincidence? Or is there some sort of higher power at work, either working against me or on my behalf? And in the case of Tanaka, it seemed like things were just conspiring against him. Everything from his teacher talking about hierarchy, him and his classmates collecting erasers, him getting scammed on that internet bid for the eraser by the username Ditch Ich Ich, to his obsession with birds and with the dodo, to him having this obsession with the video game Zuden, trying to catch the dodo, and eventually to Otokawa almost running him over the minute that he captures that dodo, right? And his phone flies into the gutter and he loses it. When all those things happen in your life, it really makes you wonder, is this really all just coincidence, or is somehow everything connected in some sort of way? And for Tanaka, it was a sort of awakening, realizing that everything was just against him, and he was done with it. He was done putting up with it. He was going out to get vengeance. This wasn't just vengeance for him losing the dodo. This was vengeance for getting scammed when he was a child. This was vengeance for him not being one of the popular kids, having to resort to collecting erasers. Vengeance for his bird that had died, probably because he neglected it himself. And so this is a person that's out on a mission. And what I really liked about his story was that he, as an adult, he was going out to do these things to provide some sort of vindication for who he was as a child. And I thought about a similarity in my life. You can see back here that I collect Jordan shoes. And part of the reason why I collect Jordans as an adult is because these are shoes that I really wanted when I was a kid. And oftentimes, I couldn't get those shoes as a kid. Either they were too expensive or my parents didn't really want to buy them for me. Whatever the reason might be, as an adult, I now kind of look back and say, you know what, I'm going to buy that because that's something that I wanted as a kid and I never got. Right? This is vindication for who I was as a child. I'm now going to go out and I don't care if that Pokemon card costs me $2,000. I never had one as a kid, so I'm going to go ahead and spend the money to get that Pokemon card. And while that does provide some satisfaction, you do have to understand that, is it really me who's wanting to do that now, today? Because collecting Pokemon cards sounds like a bit childish, right? Like, which adult wants to spend thousands of dollars collecting a cardboard card? And yet we do that all the time. We do that with Magic cards, with baseball cards, Pokemon cards, really any sort of collection items. And a lot of those tendencies and that satisfaction or gratification that we get from buying or purchasing these things stem from our childhood and our satisfaction that we had with those things as a child, or maybe the inability to be able to go out and buy those things ourselves when we were kids. We are now adults, we have the money, so now we go and we purchase those things. So I thought that was a really cool story about Tanaka, connecting that into a real world sort of experience. And as a side note, Doku, who actually scams Tanaka from the eraser, right? His username is ditch11. I actually found out that Doku means ditch in English. So there's some foreshadowing there happening, right? If you understand, I guess, Japanese, and you know that his name was Doku. Doku means ditch. Ditch11 is who scammed Tanaka out of the Donraku eraser. All right, the next thing that I wanted to touch on that I thought was really cool was the backstory of both the Damon brothers and Orokawa. Because both of these characters, and you find out in that second or third to last episode, actually are both products of the same foundation that provided for them when they were kids. Remember, this is a foundation that is run by the head mob boss, and this foundation takes in orphans who are orphaned because of traffic accidents, and it provides for them as they're growing up. Orokawa was one of the orphans in this foundation, and you also find out that the Damon brothers were also orphans in the foundation, right? The parents of the Damon brothers, they were killed in a traffic accident. And if you recall, it was actually a taxi driver that had killed them. Part of the reason why Big Damon has such a big hatred for taxi drivers and Orokawa, right? This stems from his childhood accident and his parents being taken away because of a taxi driver. And I thought it was interesting that both Big Damon and Orokawa have a very similar reaction, except for they're in different parts of their life. At the end of the show, Orokawa wants to use that money to keep the foundation going. He wants the money to go to support orphan kids who are orphaned because of traffic accidents. And Big Damon, even though he's a cop, he gives back in the exact same way. The reason why he's kind of partnered up with Doku isn't because he's a crooked cop, even though he is. It's because he understands that the leader of the foundation is Doku's boss, right? Kuroda is the main mob boss, and he's also the head of the foundation. So Big Damon, yes, he's a crooked cop, but he's not crooked because he's an evil person. He's crooked because it's his way of giving back to the foundation that provided for him when he was a child. And in this sense, he's no different than Orokawa, who ends up giving the money to Kuroda at the very end. As a matter of fact, he even says, I know that what you do is wrong sometimes, and you do bad things, but I still want to give you this money, and I want it to go to continue to support the program that supported me when I was an orphan. So I thought that connection between Big Damon and Orokawa was really cool as well, even though on one end we cheer for Orokawa, right, as the hero, and on the other end we might condemn Big Damon, but in reality they're both doing the same thing in their own way. They're giving back to the foundation that gave to them. And we find out that they're both orphans of this same foundation because of the little white rubber ducky that hangs on Otokawa's rearview mirror. That duck is given to children who end up essentially graduating from the foundation and go out on the world on their own. The foundation gives each of them one of those ducks, and it's funny because the Japanese translation on the duck actually says drive safe, right? Which is a reminder to say, hey, your parents were taken from you because of a traffic accident. Do your best to not repeat the same thing and drive safe out there.